Hello, and welcome to another second grade episode of Math Matters. I'm Miss Beckett, and today we are going to learn a lot about growing patterns. As you follow along today, think about how you were able to identify a growing pattern, create a growing pattern, describe the core of a growing pattern, and extend a growing pattern. We will have the opportunity for you to reflect on your learning at the end of the lesson. Also, as you are working today, you will have an opportunity to practice your Portrait of a Graduate creative and critical thinking skills by thinking about solutions in a new or different way and working on being goal-directed and resilient by staying on task during our lesson time together today. For today's lesson, you will need some paper, a pencil, and objects to make a pattern with. Maybe you want to go get some socks, silverware, Legos, blocks, any other toys you have that will be good for making a pattern later in today's lesson. We'll give you some time to go get those things and come right back. Let's get started. Look at this image on the screen. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Maybe you were wondering, like me, how many cherries would be in the fourth pile where the red rectangle is. What do you think? How many cherries would be in the fourth pile, and how do you know? I was thinking about how the cherries were changing each time. I noticed it started with 1 cherry, then added 3 cherries to make 4 cherries, then added 3 more cherries to make 7 cherries. Both times 3 more cherries were added, so I think the fourth pile has to also add 3 more cherries. 7 plus 3. Oh, that's a making 10 fact I know, so the fourth pile must have 10 cherries. What can you tell me about this pattern? You may have talked about the core of the pattern. What is the core of this pattern? That's it. I'm going to circle the core. Using any object you found around the house, I want you to create this pattern. Look at how I created it using silverware around my house. Now you try it. Use what you have around your house to create the same pattern as the circles on the screen. I bet your patterns are looking really good. If I were to extend this pattern, what would come next? Fork and spoon. Now extend your pattern. What do you notice about the shapes in this pattern? How could you describe this pattern? This pattern is different than a repeating pattern like the one we just saw with the circles. What do you think this type of pattern is called? It's a growing pattern. How many squares did we start with? 2. Then how many? 4. How many squares are in our next part of the pattern? 6. And then how many? 8. Use the objects around your house to copy this pattern. If we were to extend this pattern, what would the next part look like? Show it using the objects in front of you. How many objects were in your next step of the pattern? Did yours have 10? That's great! We learned this pattern is called a growing pattern. Why do you think it's called a growing pattern? It's a growing pattern because the number of objects is increasing each time. Now that we know our pattern is increasing by 2 each time, if I wanted to extend the pattern one more time, how many squares would come next after 10 squares? Did you think 12? If we're adding 2 each time in this pattern, 10 plus 2 more gives us 12 squares in the next step of our pattern. This picture shows a growing pattern. In a growing pattern, something is added to the core each time it repeats. In this pattern, the core is one X and one green octagon. Each time, the X repeats and there is one more green octagon added. Take a look at this pattern. Is this a repeating or growing pattern? How do you know? It's a repeating pattern. 3, 3, 5 is the core, and it continues again and again and again. Let's look at this pattern. Is this a repeating or growing pattern? How do you know? It's a growing pattern because the numbers are getting bigger by 5 each time. Is this a repeating or growing pattern? How do you know? It's a growing pattern because the numbers are growing or getting bigger by 2 each time. Now it's time for you to use your paper and pencil you brought with you for this lesson. This is a growing pattern. Draw what the next picture would look like. How would you describe this pattern? I noticed each time one more triangle was added. So that must mean in picture 5, there would be 5 triangles. Here's another growing pattern. Draw what the next picture would look like. How would you describe this pattern? I noticed each time more squares were added. First, 2 squares were added, then 3 squares were added, then 4 squares were added. This must mean 5 squares need to be added. So picture 5, the next stage in our pattern, would have 15 squares. Draw what the next stage would look like in this pattern. How would you describe this pattern? I was thinking about what was changing each time. I noticed each time 2 more circles were being added. That must mean that picture 5 would add 2 more circles from picture 4. So picture 5 would have 9 circles. You've already learned so much about growing patterns today. Here are 2 number patterns. Which of these is a growing pattern? Which is a repeating pattern? How do you know? The top pattern is a growing pattern because it's getting bigger each time. The bottom pattern is a repeating pattern because 2, 4, 6 is the core of the pattern and it repeats over and over again. In today's episode of Math Matters, we learned how to identify and create a growing pattern. How did you do today working towards our learning goal? Give a thumbs up if you feel like you got it, a thumb in the middle if you're still practicing, or a thumb down if you need help from a teacher or someone at home. We also learned how to describe and extend growing patterns. Give a thumbs up if you feel like you got it, a thumb in the middle if you're still practicing, or a thumb down if you need help from a teacher or someone at home. Mathematicians are goal-directed and creative thinkers. Take a moment to reflect on yourself as a mathematician today. Were you able to persevere and stick to the learning goals for today? Were you creative and able to think about finding solutions in a new or different way? What might you work on tomorrow? Thank you for joining me for today's second grade episode of Math Matters. I'm Miss Beckett and hope you will tune in for more math fun tomorrow. And remember, Be on the lookout in your homes for more examples of patterns.